part of why we brought David and Ed back together is because we had a slam dunk of a webinar. There was over 400 folks who registered on March 9th to hear more about SEC and FINRA's Reg BI examinations and the focus on the care obligation. Throughout the webinar, there was a long list of questions. What we've done is we've collated the questions, focused on some of the common questions that came up that we didn't have a chance to take up during the conversation. And so we're gathered today to double click on some of those common questions and ask our expert panelists what their views are. So to jump right in, one of the notations or one of the comments made throughout the conversation was that documentation is an important element when considering the assessment of reasonably available alternatives. Now, the question in response to this has been, is it in your respective view that there, given that there is no prescriptive written requirement to document reasonably available alternatives, a firm will potentially receive a deficiency letter if they don't document reasonably available alternatives across their registered reps?
Well, maybe I could start with that question, Param. It's a great question, and it's probably the question that we've been asked most in terms of documentation. Is there a requirement to provide documentation? And the SEC did provide guidance regarding documentation. However, they wanted to allow for flexibility, but that flexibility leaves a lot of room for interpretation. And they did specifically say that they do not expect that firms document the basis for all recommendations and that firms should take a risk-based approach. But they also identified that you need to be able to demonstrate that you're complying with the rule. And sort of threading that needle can be really challenging. They identified some situations where you'd be more apt to need to document things like recommendations of complex, illiquid, or risky products would be some. So the question really is like, with that flexibility and in the absence of very prescriptive guidance, what should firms be doing? And so as we've thought about it, the recommendations that we've been given is to first and foremost make sure that you have very clear procedures. And if you're not going to require documentation of the basis for every recommendation, which you don't have to, be very clear about when documentation is necessary. Make sure that you're clear in your procedures and that you also train your representatives regarding when they need to document recommendations, and make sure that in designing those procedures that you consider the factors that the SEC's identified, including complexity, liquidity, the risk of the products or accounts that are being recommended, and importantly, the cost of the relative to the different alternatives that are available. If you're recommending more costly products, they're likely to ask you to demonstrate why that product or account was in the customer's best interest, and it would be good to have something to help demonstrate that. So again, I would say that you're not required to document the basis for every recommendation, but you should be very clear in terms of when you require it and when you don't.
Ed, if I can add to that, I think it's important to the thread that you were mentioning there is firms are evaluating their product shelf, what products they're going to have, and to the extent that they've done a good job in streamlining the products, not as many alternatives or comparisons between products, and or they've really pushed down the cost so that it's a simpler decision tree for the representatives. I can certainly see a delineated process to say, look, we're not requiring in all instances. However, to your point, Ed, when we have these sort of cost alternatives, things that we want to make sure investors really understood the liquidity features and other issues that would make the decision for the investor a bit more nuanced, then it's about having a quality recommendation. And I would add the term risk, while we tend to think of it at the point of sale, right, tied to the nature of the product, I would pose it from a litigation perspective of Risk you should be looking at retrospectively as well, which is imagine a scenario 3 months forward, 6 months forward, where the regulator comes in and says, well, we'd like to understand your process. We don't, let's say the firm has a process, says we don't always require it. Say that's fine. Let's just see the consistency of the application of that so we understand that when you did and when you don't. Was that consistently followed? And even assuming that it was, now we'd like to look at the quality of your documentation for the ones where you didn't have it. And how good is that information for you as a supervising principal to have reviewed it and approved the transaction in real time? So the risk at that stage isn't per se the complexity of the product, although obviously that's going to go into the quality of the information that was provided at the point of sale and the reasonably available alternative information. But it's also the regulatory risk of a regulator looking at it holistically across a sampling of 60 recommendations and saying whether or not they think that that recommendation or a sequence of recommendations, when looked at in the aggregate, look consistent to your policies and procedures. And then there's litigation risk, right? What is the possibility that a claimant's lawyer, a group of claimants' lawyers might nonetheless have qualms with you about a recommendation, which one might think is not particularly risky in the abstract for purposes of providing reasonably available alternative information. But that doesn't mean that from a litigation perspective, somebody can't say, well, I still feel that they didn't adequately explain something to me. I didn't quite understand the cost. I'm not really sure this was suitable for me. As we've seen over decades, anybody can sue about anything. And so to that point, the quality of documentation isn't just hey, what do the regulators mean by risk at the front end? Is it okay for me to not document everything? Absolutely, you don't have to. But there's two other vectors in looking at this backwards in time of saying, when a regulator comes in and wants to see a sampling, how much do I have that is consistent with my processes? What is that documentation going to look like in the aggregate? And then on a case-by-case basis, when a claimant gets cranky, an investor gets cranky and decides to make a complaint about it, how defensible is that recommendation going to look like in a year in hindsight, 2 years in hindsight, 6 years in hindsight, to be able to say, well, what was the basis of this recommendation? It didn't seem particularly complex at the time. So I think that those are important additional factors in evaluating. Sorry, and I'll make one last point as well, which is this came up sort of in the context of PTE 2020-02, which is, how are firms implementing the documentation of rollovers in some firms, whether or not a recommendation is being made, whether they need to if they are making a recommendation, and can we realistically avoid it? And I think that there's a broader both compliance and supervisory issue of, you're running a very small shop with a few registered representatives, and quantitatively, the transactional volume is pretty manageable. That's a different scenario than you have 120 people and 6 different branch offices. And from a supervisory and compliance perspective, how readily available is our ability to look at other paperwork or information in hindsight to try and reconstruct the basis of a recommendation if we're not documenting it at the point of sale. So it's at some level, I think it's a quantity driven analysis, not just quality, in terms of how much are we talking about, that if I'm pressed upon to look at this in hindsight because a regulator comes in because an investor is unhappy, is it something that I can really manage this volume day to day such that I don't think we need to document every recommendation. So I think,
well, David, you make a good an important distinction between documentation for the basis for recommendations, which we're saying you don't have to do every one, but you have to be thoughtful, but then also documenting that you have an effective process in place. And so, you have to look at both of those. And, we talked a lot about the basis for the recommendations, but in terms of documenting the process, when you read the SEC's risk alert and FINRA's report on exams and risk monitoring with respect to Reg BI, they both go into a lot of detail about their feedback on what they're seeing when they're conducting examinations with respect to the process. And so it's really incumbent on firms to make sure that they're able to demonstrate through documentation that that process is in place. And that includes the policies and procedures, it includes the training, it includes the monitoring, and then the follow-up to the monitoring. So in addition to the question about whether you have to document recommendations, all of those things need to be documented as well. And that's something, it's helpful to be able to show the regulators what process you have in place, so that if there is a question, you can make a claim that the process that you do have is reasonably designed.
Love the insights. This is exactly the value added conversation that tends to come up a lot, and a lot of folks focus in on, do I need to document every single transaction? And I think the way you've looked at that more holistically, as opposed to transaction by transaction, more so broadly across your organization, across your financial professional workforce, can you illustrate that there is a consistent process across the board? And I'd argue that in a world where technology can simplify that process, why not leverage somewhat of a consistent process that makes that documentation piece a lot easier? And to your point, Ed, the SEC's latest risk alert in January sort of talks to exactly that point and says, hey, if there's no documentation, how are you going to ensure compliance with your own policies and procedures, let alone but I can certainly see the confusion. So in the marketplace, given the way the regs are written and the way they're being interpreted now. One more specific question that comes up is around, David, you touched on this, around sort of this notion of a product shelf or an approved decision tree. We tend to get a lot of questions, and this came up during the webinar as well. With this assessment of available alternatives or costs, would it ever bleed outside of the available capabilities, offerings, or products that are available at a particular firm?
Yeah, so I think there's two ways to look at that, right? The first is, in order to make this process easier at the point of recommendation, in which a financial advisor, registered representative is having a conversation with a client, I think what Regulation BI afforded firms was a clarity to simplify their product shelf. A lot of firms had a very open architecture. So, whatever it is you want, just kind of let us know what you're thinking beforehand. And to the extent that that model still applies to your firm, then you'd say, well, since you have a fairly open architecture, as long as people provide reasonably available alternative information between what we have on our shelf and other products that are not on our shelf, that would almost be incumbent upon the firm in a circumstance in which we have a fairly open architecture, right? If you're saying, well, we only have 3 or 4 of a particular type of variable annuity on our product shelf, but we give the representatives pretty broad rein to propose or recommend even potentially other products. If you have that type of open architecture with some very quick approval requirements, then I almost think you're imposing it upon yourself. Conversely, if you say, well, we have to have some boundaries. We at the product committee level have vetted certain product manufacturers. Within those product manufacturers, we allow them to recommend a variety of, in this example, variable annuities. And so there can be a lot of variety within a particular manufacturer of the product that they have. I think it becomes an issue of saying, look, if you're not going to have a more refined product list, a specific issuer, and or whatever the variabilities may be in terms of durational terms on the product, economic terms, share classes, whatever the differentiators may be, the SEC made clear, look, you don't have an obligation on your platform to offer everything in the world. That's not the point. You just need to tell people, look, here's what I do have. That sounds fine in the abstract, but then you say, all right, well, you said you're going to offer variable annuities. How many different flavors do you have? Saying, well, we're really recommending a couple of 3 different, we've done enough to pick 3 different product manufacturers. And within that, there's a lot of variable products that there may be, and we give them some flexibility to pick among them and saying, that's fine. At the end of the day, what you need to have is a justification that says of the product that you're offering, it may not be the cheapest in the market at writ large, but at least on your platform, if you have a couple of other options available on your platform, have you done a cost comparison and or, the other qualitative distinctions between this one is a little bit more expensive than this one, but this has some different terms or features to it. So it kind of depends upon what we're trying to do for you. So I think it's really helping people understand of what you have to offer. How does this potentially meet your needs, and helping them understand that, hey, look, if there's some other aspects or features of what we're trying to achieve for you, given your other suitability factors, your time horizon, your liquidity needs, your investment objective, risk profile, et cetera, if there's something else that our product is not quite a good fit for, well, don't put a square peg in a round hole either, right? It's not just selling what you have to offer. I think it's saying, from what I think you're trying to achieve, here's a few different options, but if that may not work, we can jump to another asset class. When I've had these conversations before with registered reps, of people to whom really Reg BI is second nature because they've been doing this for years, they don't go and sell because the firm has a particular product. They approach it of, what are we trying to achieve? Let me put a few different types of products in front of you that have very different features so that I can better gauge what it is you're trying to achieve. Something that's a bit more principal protected versus something that's a bit more aggressive and has a higher return profile to it. And they use different asset classes to winnow the client down. And even in that comparison of different asset classes, a variable annuity versus a mutual fund versus an ETF or a UIT, something like that, they're using that to help winnow them down. And even at that higher level, you can still be having a cost comparison analysis. Here's how this product works. Here's how it charges sales and commissions. Here's how that kind of burns off. Here's the time horizon you need to be using it for. And I think even documenting that very high level, we talked about these three different asset classes. We talked about this product, and this product. It's going to make the ultimate asset class that you then focus upon. Okay, we really decided that for them, a particular type of mutual fund, whatever share class it might be, would be the best one for them. And then now in the final analysis, I have the reasonably available alternatives within that specific asset class. But even having documented how you got to that asset class in the first place with a little bit of comparative analysis as to how those products vary really makes a strong case as to, did you just laser focus on this asset class? How'd you get here? And no, I had an explanation where we talked about the comparative features between these, the return profile, the costs generally, the time horizon. And so then we isolated upon this asset class, and then I presented the couple of three that we had available on our platform.
Yeah, absolutely. If you think about the care obligation, there's really two components of it that the SEC identified. Really there's a customer specific aspect of what you were talking about, Dave. Is this right for this particular customer given their situation, their financial profile, their objectives and needs? And then there's the reasonable basis portion of the care obligation, where you have to take a look at your products and say, do we have a reasonable basis to believe that the products that we're offering are in the best interests of our clients in general? And I think that that's really where this particular piece hits. No, you don't have to have, they're not dictating what you have on your shelf, and you only have to consider what's on your shelf. But I think there is an expectation, like you had mentioned, David, that you're reviewing that shelf and making sure that the products that you are offering, you look at what else is available out there, that you're offering products that you have a reasonable basis to believe that they're in the best interest of your clients. And so it goes back to that documenting your process. What is your process for assessing your product shelf against what else might be out there, and making sure that you can come back and say, look, we've got this process, we assess our products on a regular basis. Our shelf is X, but here's why it's X, and it's meant to meet our clients' needs. So I think that it's just another area where you really need to make sure that you're documenting your process, both that you have a process and that you're following that process. Additionally, what the SEC did say too is that you can't use the fact that you have a limited product shelf as a reason to make recommendations that aren't in the client's best interest. Or, when you think about account types, if you're just an investment advisor or just a broker dealer, only offer a limited number of types of account types, that you can't use that as justification for doing something that might otherwise be not in the client's best interest. So there are things that you have to keep in mind, but that monitoring and knowing what's on your shelf and making sure that you're assessing what's on your shelf is really important. And shelves can grow over time as you're doing your recruiting and you're bringing new reps on and you're bringing on all the products that they sell and putting them on your shelf. It's important to periodically go through that and make sure that you're comfortable that what you're recommending, you have a credible argument that it's in the client's best interest.
And that's a great point, Ed, you make in terms of the fluidity or the sort of living nature of your product shelf, not just because of just what goes into vogue and what doesn't, but this issue where you bring on new people, they come from another firm where they had different products than what you had. That means the customers they brought over may have a different product mixture. The objective shouldn't be immediately recommending that they liquidate all of that and put themselves into products that you sponsor, but it does require the product committee to be flexible and saying, okay, these are, we don't have selling agreements with some of these product manufacturers, but that's okay. These clients are holding these things are kind of equivalent to what we have. And it's just being flexible and understanding those situations as well. We tend to approach these things from a very static viewpoint of starting today, but these firms are dealing with customers coming in, customers transferring out, products coming in, products transferring out, and so being able to be flexible. And okay, this isn't a traditional product that we sponsor, but that's fine. This client's brought over this new account. They have these products in it. We're not, if and when we get to an annual review and we have to make some decisions about whether or not we continue to hold it, then we're going to have to do an evaluation as to why we're making a hold recommendation potentially. And that may be different because we don't have a lot of background or experience with this particular product. And that's an example where maybe it doesn't get captured at the time that the account transfers in or the products come over. But at least as part of a review process, an annual review, a check-in with the client saying, hey, I may need some little bit of help. So I think getting baked into the procedures as well as to the product review process, both on a preliminary basis, how the committee evaluates what it wants to sponsor versus on an ongoing basis when situations arise where there are portfolios that have products that you haven't traditionally dealt with.
This topic really begs a larger question, which is how are firms keeping up with this dynamic process, this evolutionary process, as you all said, which is how are additional products being added to that product shelf? How are additional services being added to that product shelf? And to be able to kind of dynamically help support financial professionals as they go about their day-to-day, really without that, going back, Dave, to your point about, regulators, clients questioning decisions made 3 years, 5 years down the road. And, at the core of this is something that we believe and we advocate for, which is technology and being able to simplify that process. Because as the data that we canvassed through our webinar indicated, by and large, the vast majority of our industry is still tackling the majority of these requirements in a manual basis, right? Which is, hey, paper and pen, let me just self-attest, which doesn't necessarily give that level of protection. One key piece that came up quite often, and maybe this is the last question that I'd like to kind of address for the purpose of today, and it came up several times throughout the discussion in different ways, right? What if I have 10 products and one of them has this feature, another one has that feature? And it's really around sort of what's the purpose? What is the alchemy that this assessment or comparing different available products, reasonable products, let's just say, what is the purpose behind the assessment of costs and reasonably available alternatives that, for example, if there are 10 similar products available to a financial professional that's suitable for a client, what will that assessment derive? Any thoughts on that?
Maybe I could start. I think in terms of the purpose, why the regulators, why the SEC in particular requires this reasonably available alternative assessment is, but taking a step back with Reg BI, the main purpose of this is they want to make sure that you're making a recommendation, that it's in the client's best interest, and that you're not putting the interests of the firm or making the recommendation ahead of the customer's best interest. And to that end, they believe that in order to make a recommendation that's in the client's best interest, that you have to consider what else is available. And then based on that, why is the recommendation that you're making in the client's best interest? So I think that's just the expectation in terms of making a recommendation that's in a client's best interest. It's best interest relative to what, right? And so there are options, there are other things that are available to your clients, and you're making a recommendation of one of them. So how did you come to that conclusion? And so that's what I think they want that thought process to be. And so I think that this whole thing about documentation and process, it's really about reinforcing that thought process. And they list a number of factors. It's not exhaustive, and it has to be tailored to the particular client, their profile and objectives. But the things that you should consider. But and then one of the question comes up about costs. Do you have to consider costs all the time? And if so, do you have to choose the least costly every time? And it was interesting that they did say I don't know if it was in the bulletin, the risk alert or the bulletin regarding account types, but they did say cost, while not the only factor, is always a factor in these considerations. And so and I think they've also said that you don't have to recommend the cheapest. In fact, sometimes and maybe oftentimes the cheapest isn't the best recommendation for the client, isn't in their best interest. But you have to consider it, and you have to consider it against the other alternatives. So if you're making a recommendation, you're considering other alternatives, cost is always one of the factors. You have to assess the different costs between the products and have a reasonable basis for believing it's in the client's best interest. And to the extent that you are making a recommendation where any of those factors, but primarily cost, where if you're going to recommend a more costly product, again, it doesn't mean that it's wrong, but those are the kind of situations where you really think, if I'm going to have to be able to explain this, is this a situation that I want to document why we made this recommendation? And so it's just one of those factors. But that's kind of my understanding of sort of why this expectation is there and why this requirement's in the rule. And given that, that's really kind of how I would approach the types of things that we're asking the representatives to be thinking about, training the representatives on, and then situations where you have to determine whether you document the basis for those recommendations.
Yeah, I think a great point, Ed. If I can add a couple of thoughts, that on the one hand, I think what we're really doing is we're importing concepts of consumer protection from other areas, not necessarily the financial markets, into the financial markets. You're just saying, look, when people are making decisions about their nest egg, whether it's their fund money account or it's their retirement account, consumers need to understand that when you're making a recommendation, you're telling them why you think this is good or might be suitable for them. That going from where we were 50 years ago, sort of the single shingle theory of I'm a broker, I hung out a shingle, I'm not a fiduciary, but I have some basic responsibilities, and the evolution of that concept to say, well, if you are making a recommendation, then not only should you have embraced the various suitability factors to try and match them to this, but we want to make sure that you've considered at a minimum cost. And I think it borrows from what the SEC guidance had been for years with Best X, right? You don't have to get the cheapest execution, but if you're going to execute a security in particular price in the marketplace, what are the other qualitative factors that explain why it is that this is the price at which you got it. And it's the same thing on the recommendation buy, sell, or hold for whatever the course of action it is that you're recommending. Did you consider the cost? Yes. And if putting aside, was this not the cheapest? That's okay. What other factors explain this, and how can you document that in a way without a little bit of analysis regarding the circumstances regarding what the client was trying to do and what we had on our shelf and what we had offered them, and why in this particular context among the three products, this one was a bit more expensive, but here's why it was a better match for what we were trying to do. And let alone the other performance factors as to, this one might be cheaper, but our view is that's not been performing as well. Raises broader questions why maybe it's on our platform at all, but that's a different issue. So I think it's really this evolution of the role of the representative, as well as an evolution of consumer behavior, and understanding that they need a bit more sense that when you're making this recommendation to them, that you've considered these and are helping them make a good choice based upon you having made the recommendation and inserted yourself into the process, that you've helped them undertake some analysis. It's a bit different when you're just shopping on your phone and you're the direct consumer and you're just, buying things without a recommendation. That's your choice. Self-directed, as we would call it in the brokerage industry. But if you're making the recommendation, they want to make sure that you've undertaken some further thought beyond why or why not this product is the best one for them.
Amazing insights. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Ed. I can sort of self-attest that over the past 2 years, we've been helping some of our clients capture this reasonably available alternatives analysis, and the data speaks volumes around the purpose behind this reasonably available alternatives analysis. We've seen, I don't want to over exaggerate, but year over year, 15% improvements around the relative metrics around cost, risk, and return of products that are being recommended purely for the reason of assessing reasonable alternatives at the time of recommendations, assessing costs. So, when it comes down to the purpose of the requirements, you've covered the sort of the theory as well as the practical implications of doing it. We've seen it now with data and technology to sort of say, oh man, this certainly makes sense. How would you do this without the capabilities of having a technology solution pop up 5, 10, 20 different alternatives that may be available at the time of the recommendation? So I'll kind of leave that with that. Ed, any other thoughts on that?
I was just going to respond because you talk about doing this on a manual basis, and I think that's really one of the big challenges, and something that the SEC identified in their risk alert is, you need to provide the reps in the field that are making the recommendations with enough information so that they can do the assessment, which is let them know and have some basis for understanding what those comparables are, but then also having access to the information in order to compare those things, cost, risk, performance, and things like that. And if you're doing it on a manual basis, I think it can be done. It just becomes very challenging to provide that information out so that they can do it in a timely fashion. But then also, like we've been talking, is how do you document that too?
If I can add to that, and I think you highlighted a great point about sort of what it means to be doing it on a manual basis. We're in a data-driven world, and more importantly, the more of it that there is to analyze, the more that we need to use the tools to help us synthesize the data that we're confronted with. So, something that helps me compare products on our shelf with some color coding, so to speak, that enables the representative to get through the process a bit more efficiently and without making a slip up, and at the same time to nimbly compare what we have to offer is going to make the process more efficient and, more importantly, more defensible. both to the regulator as well as to, keeping the eye on the ball of anybody can sue anybody for anything. And I come back to that of saying, look, it's a lot more defensible to say we have a fairly automated process. The conversation I have with my client isn't automated. I had conversations, I walked them through what we were doing. That's the manual part. And the firm affords me certain tools to help consolidate a lot of information. And I relied upon the quality of that in making this recommendation. And you're going to have a hard time quibbling with that as a regulator or claimant's lawyer if, based upon the quality of information, synthesizing the volume of data that they were confronted with. And it says, look, these things had, there were good reasons for these comparisons, and there was good information presented to me, and I followed that. So I think I kind of follow that thread, which is give people good information and a way to synthesize a lot of information, and they'll do their job right.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Ed. I think we've talked about some of the theoretical, historical, as well as the practical implications of some of the questions that came up. We appreciate everyone's questions throughout the conversations that we've been having with our audience, and hope everybody enjoyed the conversation. Ed, David, thank you again.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.